Kazuha's rerun banner is on the horizon. In fact, at least for me, it's in a couple of hours, so I want to give you a good idea of how to build him. As you may see here, and before we actually get into the guide, I do build my Kazuha with essentially full elemental mastery. This means that he has no crit and no crit damage. He has a bunch of energy recharge, but that's primarily due to his weapon right now. He is C0, and his talents are pretty low, 4, 3, and 4. If you intend to use Kazuha as an elemental mastery support to buff your hyper carries, like hypothetically you want to buff a Yelan or a Raiden Shogun, then you don't necessarily need to build or level up any of the talents. His talents dictate his damage. They don't dictate the amount of buffing he's doing. With that being said, let's get into it. For the vast majority of you, I recommend Favonius Sword. The only time I recommend going over a different weapon is either if you have R5 of Zephos Moonlight or you have Freedom Sworn. Both of these weapons are incredibly good. I typically want Freedom Sworn, but as you can see here, it's on my Nilo right now. With this being said, I want to clarify. Kazuha is an individual whose primary buffing capabilities rely on his ability to swirl another element, Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro. And as a result of that, you do want him to essentially either use his burst to have that uptime, or to at least pick up an element with his skill. You want pretty high uptime on his elemental burst, and if you don't have a bunch of Favonius weapons running around, like hypothetically you're not running him in a team with somebody like Yelan and a Zhongli for the Fav bonuses, you're going to be pretty low on energy all the time. So it means in a vast majority of situations, even for me personally, even though Freedom Sworn is a good weapon, it is not the best choice because if he can't burst, he doesn't do his job. His stats are pretty simple. I'm going to be blunt and honest with you all. Elemental Mastery, full Elemental Mastery. Elemental Mastery 110 here. Elemental Mastery here. Elemental Mastery here. You just want EM and Viridescent Venerer. There is no other viable and worthwhile set for a support Kazuha. He is one of the simplest characters to build, and don't get me wrong, whilst he's simple, he's still really good. He doesn't necessarily fit into as many team comps as people will think he does. I've mentioned before my Shuru Summon guide, or the video analyzing both banners, I think he's overvalued for a lot of people's accounts. With that being said, I'm still going to go over him as a whole, and talk about what teams I recommend him in, which ones I don't, and vice versa. So for general use case scenario, you want your Kazuha to have about 1000 elemental mastery. You want to get him to level 90 because his primary reaction is Swirl, and Swirl is dependent on EM and levels. So you want to get him to max level. You want him to essentially be like a Nilo, like an Albedo, so on. With this level 90 perk, you essentially want to, at a certain point, you can decide whether or not you're dictating if you want more EM, if you want more energy recharge, if you maybe want to build some attack. If you're going for a DPS build, the standard rotations apply. You would essentially build him like a Xiao. Crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and the EM is nice, but doesn't matter as much. I personally recommend just going full EM. However, if you're looking at Constellations, because whether or not this is your favorite character, or you just like a design, or you really want to buff up your other units, C2 is honestly a really good pickup. Now, keep in mind, Kazuha does not benefit in the slightest to Dendro-oriented teams. This is because he can only swirl Hydro, Cryo, and Electro. Yes, Hydro and Electro can react perfectly well with Dendro teams, but he doesn't benefit the Dendro element itself, so it's kind of an iffy scenario to throw him in. That C2 is great if running something like a Melt Ganyu, because the Melts deal a bunch more damage because of the addition of 200 EM. But if you're hyper carrying Raiden, for instance, that 200 EM doesn't mean much. His C1, if you're thinking about it, actually just, even though it says it reduces the cooldown and resets the cooldown, the main benefit of this is it gives you a bit more leniency with energy recharge. In fact, my thing to consider would be, think of his C1 like Raiden C1. In that, yes, it does give you a slightly higher damage output, but realistically, it just makes building up either stacks or building up to that C2 benefit more easily. In this instance, it helps him get his burst back. Outside of that C2, the other ones are not really worthwhile in my opinion. They're there, but they're not like the be-all end-all of his kit. Instead, I'd say that for the vast majority of you, if you want him, use him with Favonius weapons, use him with something like Sapwood Blade for the energy recharge, but that's it. If you got the event weapons here, they're all great. His story quest weapon, even though it looks nice, is god awful for him because it doesn't benefit him in the slightest for his buffing capabilities. However, if you want to use it for the drip, go ahead, I won't judge you. I give Zhongli usually Sino's weapon because it's drippy. But with that being said, let's talk about his teams. For support Kazuha, that is. The essential rotation you want to consider when building Kazuha is, can it be a mono team? If it is a mono team, he fits in there. Take out Zhongli or take out Bennett. If you're running something like Mono Pyro with Yoimiya, you go Bennett with a Yoimiya, Kazuha, and then a Zhongli. Because he can't swirl Geo, he's only going to be swirling Pyro, benefiting these two greatly. Zhongli's just there for defensive units. For something like Ganyu, if you're a Ganyu main like myself, you actually run into an issue. Ganyu, Zhangling, Bennett, Zhongli is our standard comp. If you want to replace Zhangling with Nahida, you can, and you actually get more benefit than Kazuha, strictly because Nahida has a burst that applies and gives a team-wide EM buff, and the burning continuously allows you to melt a bit more frequently than with Kazuha. With Kazuha, it relies on his energy and Ganyu making all her shots. Because that burst doesn't last so long, you do need to be a bit more careful with him and with her. So even though he's an option for Melt Ganyu, I'd honestly say Zhangling is the best option. Nahida being there as well is also a pretty good option. Both of them are interchangeable. Kazuha is probably the last recommendation I would make. Now for mono elemental teams, you can obviously go with Kazuha in the slot just to buff up a hyper carry. However, if you are considering buffing a hyper carry, please know this. Kazuha is a bit different than other units in how he buffs. With somebody like Bennett, because its ult gives so much attack and healing, he can buff anyone. He could buff your Wander, he could buff your Albedos, Burst, he could buff anybody. With somebody like Kazuha, his main benefit to buffing is usually for hyper carries. Because he's not buffing a elemental reaction like Nilo, that doesn't matter. And even though his buff is elemental damage, it's not as good as crit rate, crit damage, and in some cases can fall off a bit higher if your character gets a ton of elemental damage. So, who are the ideal characters to receive this buff? In my opinion, it is going to be any individual who already deals extraordinarily high amounts of damage. This could be your Raiden Shogun at C0, but especially at C2. This could be your Ganyu. This could be your Hu Tao. Your Mia not so much, because your Mia's E skill duration is long enough, but she doesn't dish out enough damage to justify it. Instead, you'd be better off running Vaporize. Or your Yae Miko's Burst. In my personal opinion, for the most part, I would run Kazuha with Raiden Shogun, Yae Miko, and a Bennett just to fully buff up that team. But outside of this, he's really meant to just buff up specifically strong hyper carry. If we're looking at these hyper carries, it could be somebody like an Aika right before she releases a burst for the crowd damage bonus. It could be an Ayato for a skill. But my main point is, don't look at a Kazuha and say he's going to buff up your entire account, when for the vast majority of situations, you may not actually use him. I have him, I have his signature. I don't use him a lot. I use him sparingly, and for the most part, I use his weapon. Venti, for me, is more valuable just for a crowd control unit. As a buffer, it really depends. For a lot of my previous Kazuha-based situations, Nahida's taken over him just for the EM buff she gives, and the access to Dendro reactions. He's an extremely simple character to build, and if you're building him as a support, his talents don't matter at all. I'd actually recommend leaving them below just to save on resources, and then coming back to them if he's your favorite character, or if you choose to level him up. He's staying at 80 out of 80 for me, his talents are staying low, he's not my favorite character, but he exists, and that's about all there is to him. My personal recommendation for all of you is, if you don't have a DPS, go for Ahaitam. If you do have a DPS and do have a unit who can actually benefit a pretty decent margin, like a Raiden, like a Yelan, like a Ganyu, then feel free to pull for him. If your units are somebody like Nilo, Xiao, or Sino, it's a bit more of an iffy scenario because you need to entirely rely on Kazuha's burst, properly buffing them, so it's a lot more energy dependent. Please understand that before going into summoning for him. Either way, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like down below, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.